So it seems everybody will be seated soon. So my name is Břetislav Tureček, and I'm really honored to moderate this discussion. And let me first of all to welcome and introduce our two guests. Professor Ilan Pappé is a distinguished scholar of Israeli origin. However, some 15 years ago or 14 years ago, he left his country and moved to United Kingdom. And after University of Haifa or Haifa University, he's now a professor at University of Exeter in England. He came to Czech Republic to introduce his new book. Actually, it's Czech version, it's Czech edition, which is 10 myths about Israel. And basically, I will soon ask Professor Pappe to explain what myth he's talking about, what myth he's referring to, and why should we call this basic knowledge for many people a myth. By the way, there is a desk, there is a table just at the entrance to this hall where you can look and buy also this book. You see the hand with the book. This is the place where you can buy your own copy after the discussion. Our second guest is Mr. Lubomír Zaorálek. As the Czech audience definitely knows, he is a former speaker of the Czech Parliament. Mr. Zaorálek also was a Ministry of Culture, but he's invited here mostly because of his experience of Minister of Foreign Affairs. Because as you know, the title of today's discussion is, can we talk about Israeli Apartheid? And how should look like the foreign policy vis-à-vis Israel. Therefore, I think we hardly find any other expert on that, because we can ask openly about such a sensitive question only people who are out of politics, I would say. Can we imagine that you would be a Minister of Foreign Affairs openly talking about this point? You will say later. Okay. So, before we start a discussion, there will be, of course, a space for your questions and perhaps also very brief comments, but I would prefer questions, of course. I would ask our guests to have some, let's say, 5 minutes opening speech. I will ask first Professor Pappe to say basically what are the 10 myths about Israel and why it worth for him to write a book about them. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you? No. Yes. Yes? You can hear me? Yes. Okay, very good. Thank you. I will only tell you 5 out of the 10 so that you have to buy the book. The idea for the book actually came after long years of being a public speaker on behalf of the Palestinian cause in many parts of the world. And an Israeli Jew who knew very well the history of Israel and became acquainted with the history of Palestine, I felt that one of the main reasons for such vast support for Israel and not enough solidarity and compassion towards the Palestinian people had to do with a certain historical narrative or historical version that most people who were interested in Israel or Palestine were educated upon. And I decided that it's important to locate the mythology, the myths that inform people's position today, which are based on their understanding of the past. And what I did in this book, I was trying to show, on the one hand, the myth, on the other hand, the academic research that refuted the myth. Because in just few minutes, I will not, of course, describe all the myths, but basically I divided the book into 3 parts: the myth about the past, the myth about the present, and the myth about the future. And I think if you look at all the mythology about the past, it you still get the impression when you hear politicians, even academics who should know better, there is a sense that Palestine was a place that was empty, that the Jewish people came back to a place which was primitive, maybe desert, and for no good reason, people in the country or around the country rejected the noble idea of a Jewish state. It also meant that people were blind to the fact that the Jewish settlement or colonization of Palestine was not a unique historical event. A lot of Europeans who were persecuted in Europe were looking for life outside of Europe, wanting to build a Europe that didn't want them. That's how the United States became a state. That's how Canada became a state. That's how Australia and South Africa became a state. These were European settlers who went to a non-European country because Europe didn't want them. And their main problem was that someone else was living there. And usually what happened to the local native people is that in the terrible cases of North America, they were genocided. In the case of Palestine, the idea of creating a Jewish state had to go through the removal of as many Palestinians as possible from Palestine. This is an important historical understanding because whatever the Israelis did before 48, during 1948, and after 1948, is based on this idea that Palestine, historical Palestine, does not belong to the Palestinians, but is the promised land for the Jews. And you have the right to create a Jewish state. Ironically, because you want to create a Jewish democracy, you want to make sure that the Jews are always the majority. And when Zionism came to Palestine, the Jews were a small minority, and you had to make sure that the demographic balance changes. We may talk more about the myths about the past. The myths about the present are also important because there is a tendency to see the Palestinian resistance as a terrorist movement, as the Palestinians are people who have a tendency to be violent, that they represent the primitive Arab world and Israel represents civilized Europe. Again, if you just change your lenses a little bit and you accept that the Palestinian movement is an anti-colonialist movement, you understand much better the reasons for the Palestinian resistance and why it is wrong to call the Palestinian national movement a terrorist movement, and one can understand much better why the Palestinians are resisting a state and ideology that sees them as aliens and strangers in their own country. And as for the future, I myself bought into the myth that the only reasonable solution in such a conflict is two states. It sounds very reasonable. There is a land that people are arguing about, so you divide the land. The more you look into that situation, you understand that in the balance of power that exists, partition can only lead to the creation of an apartheid state with two Palestinian Bantustans next to it. So we need to get out of this paradigm that for 55 years people were trying to push it. It's not working, and the reality of the ground has changed dramatically since 1967, and solutions have to take into account realities. Twice the international community offered solutions that had nothing to do with the reality. First in 1947, when it told the native people of Palestine, you have to give half of your homeland to the settler movement that came from Europe 3 years before. That was nothing to do with the reality on the ground. It sounded very reasonable and fair, but it had nothing to do with the reality. And recently, people are talking about a two-state solution as if there is any space for a Palestinian state. Since 1967, there are Israeli cities, there are Israeli urban sprawls all over the West Bank. So any talk about a two-state solution can only mean a greater Israel and a very small Palestinian Bantustan. So I think all these myths about the past, the present, and the future reflect a certain narrative that if we stick to it, we will continue with the present reality of oppression, colonialism, ethnic cleansing, and this can only lead to more bloodshed, which will affect the stability not only of historical Palestine and Israel, but also of the Arab world as a whole.
Thanks a lot for your opening speech, Ilan. I think there will be many questions or follow-up ideas about what you said right now, but let me now switch to at least European or Czech diplomacy, to Mr. Zaorálek. You heard about impossibility of reaching two-state solution. However, it is a base of not only Czech, but European and actually global policy. Let's force both the Israelis and Palestinians to find a two-state solution. Besides Israel, also an Arab-Palestinian state. As a former foreign minister, Mr. Zaorálek, why did we not succeed? How it was? How difficult it was for you? What tools we had as a Czech Republic to convince both the parties to settle their conflict, their dispute? Did you see any hope at the end? Did you have an idea that after several years in your position, you at least reach some of your initial goals in that field?
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. I would like to say on the beginning that I'm glad that I have opportunity to meet Mr. Ilan Pappé, that I can welcome here in Prague, and also that I can say thank you for this book about 10 myths Israel, because I'm convinced that we need a similar book in Czech Republic. I have doubts that we are able to have a balanced position in our current Czech foreign policy. And yeah, I know that we have 71 MPs in friendship groups, Israeli-Czech friendship groups, but it does not mean that we have really also knowledge what is really happening right now in your, and as you said in this book that two-state solution is a corpse, which is time from time it is out from the box and it alive. I agree with this picture because I'm also convinced that now it is only a corpse. I know that this on the beginning it was a declaration, a resolution of the United Nations in 1947. It's under international law. It's right, and it's true. But on the other hand, if you take current state and current conditions, I can't imagine how to create this. It's nonsense, and that's why. If a long time we were convinced that it's a European position, then it's time also to say that it doesn't work, and we can face, and as you said, and maybe we can accept this oppression, as you said, and the permanent hostility as terminal, as something as the result of the war, and for some extraordinary time. But to accept this, when we speak about West Bank, it is 50 years. Accept this situation when we have system judicial system for people. If we are born Arab, or it's absolutely different. It's different from the beginning. It was not. We are in Czech Republic convinced that so Israeli is bastion of democracy, but it's true that from the beginning. After the war between Arabs and Israelis in 1948, yes, it was democratic system, but position of Jews was different than position of Arab from the beginning. I am ready to accept it as terminal state, but not as permanent. And now, when I convinced there is no chance for peace process, because this time when Clinton and many others engaged is gone. Now Joe Biden is not engaging in this, and Trump, maybe it's better not to speak about it, the role of Trump in support. And maybe to return to your question, What I had opportunity to do during my stay in Minister of Foreign Affairs, I really tried to elaborate a more balanced position, and with the limited successes, because I arranged a meeting, for example, between Minister Malki and Minister Avigdor Lieberman, and politicians, between Palestinians, and I was something like mediator between these both parts. I transferred from Netanyahu to Abbas and so, and really I really tried really to use a position of Czech Republic, which was very good on both sides, and to help to start some more intensive communication. But to be short, you can imagine that it's a very difficult task, and probably impossible for any country to start similar peace process again. And I am convinced that now in these days, it seems to me practically impossible. And maybe in very shortly, now I am convinced that when I take it's a problem of politicians. Maybe Yitzhak Rabin was able to start this process, but Yitzhak Rabin was killed in 1995. Maybe it was very, very interesting, this Camp David meeting between Ehud Barak and Arafat in 2000, and it was maybe also the chance in these days. But Yitzhak Rabin was killed, and also this process was also unsuccessful. And I see no chance when started Ariel Sharon and also Benjamin Netanyahu to return successfully to this. That's why I'm afraid we are in stalemate. And I'm here also to say that these stalemates are very dangerous. We knew and we had opportunity to see similar stalemate in Ukraine. 8 years ago, we had a frozen conflict in Ukraine, and now we see how it is dangerous. Now we have open war, and we see how it is dangerous when we accept this frozen conflicts and situation which is not solved. And I feel sorry, but I'm convinced that current situation in Israel is not solved in Israel, and if we will not interest about it, if we will be convinced that nothing will happen. I'm afraid it could be dangerous. It's very risky. That's why I'm glad that we are here today and we can speak about this book. It's important, especially in Czech Republic, when I said we need to know more, to reflect and to engage.
Okay, thanks a lot to Mr. Zaorálek. We will also get back to some of your points. But now, Ilan, let me first to ask you, you are very critical of Israel. Besides this book, you also wrote the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, which basically accuses Israeli or Jewish militias of ethnically cleansing the territory to expand the Jewish population, the space for Jewish population. Still, however, you are very critical of Israel, but in the same time, cannot you say something about some fateful mistakes on the Palestinian or Arab side? For example, you said that it's unfair to call the activities of Palestinians to call it a terrorism while it is a resistance. I think we can distinguish between terrorism and resistance. Don't you think that some of the violent activities and terror activities of the Palestinians undermined their position, not only vis-à-vis Israel, but also in the international community?
Thank you. I think that it's important to understand what we talk about when we talk about Palestinian terrorism. We are talking about a nation, the Palestinian nation, that lost its homeland in 1948. Half of the Palestinian villages were destroyed by Israel in 1948. Most of the Palestinian towns were demolished by Israel in 1948. Half of the Palestinian population, this is something that sometimes I say this sentence and I'm not sure people understand the magnitude of this. Half of Palestine's population, half of a country's population became refugees. Now, in many other parts of the world, places that were colonized, there was an anti-colonial movement. An anti-colonial movement sometimes used violence in order to liberate their homeland. And part of this struggle can be violent. Part of this struggle can have some acts of terrorism. However, what we keep forgetting is the military power of the oppressor, of the occupier. As someone said rightly, if the Palestinians had F-16s, if they had tanks like Israel does, if it has cannons like Israel does, or rockets, real rockets, not the one that they are using, then they would not have used knives or suicide bombs and so on. The United Nations recognizes the right of people to defend themselves. And one of the problems with the coverage in the West on the Israeli actions is that somehow an Israeli decision to go into a Palestinian place, expel the people, build a Jewish settlement instead of the Palestinian village is not considered to be an act of terrorism. It's not considered to be even a violent act. But the Palestinian reaction to this act is immediately framed as terrorism. In every situation of violence, we need to come to the source of violence. And one of the greatest Israeli successes, I think, was to allow the world to think that the Jewish, what they would call the Jewish return to Palestine after 2,000 years of exile, was a peaceful march of people who only wanted to find a safe home. In order to create a Jewish state in Palestine, from the very beginning, you needed to expel Palestinians, you needed to drive them away, you needed to destroy their place, otherwise you would not have had a Jewish state. The price for solving anti-Semitism in Europe was the destruction of the Palestinians in Palestine. Any other nation in the world would have reacted to this destruction not only as Quakers, not only through peace.
So, no mistakes, no faults on the side of Palestinians.
Oh, many mistakes.
Oh, please.
Yeah, many mistakes.
At least few.
No, I don't have to do this. In the Czech media, you only talk about the Palestinian mistakes. I'm not going to, don't play with me. I'm not playing this game. No, I refuse to play this game. There is not one member of parliament who is a part of a friendship society with the Palestinians. You need me to balance. The whole Czech Republic is pro-Israeli in an embarrassing way. You want me to add to this? That's what you need. You need to hear in Prague pro-Palestinian propaganda. Yes, you need to hear. I'm not going to balance. I'm not idealizing the Palestinians. The problem of the Palestinians, by the way, is that they are the most normal people in the world. Most normal. They don't like to fight. They like to be agricultural. Israel has it easy. If the Jewish people would have tried to create a Jewish state in Vietnam, they would have been already kicked out from there. The Palestinians are pastoral people. Everybody who goes to 48 and study it properly understand how Palestinian villages naively believed, they really naively believed, that the creation of a Jewish state would not be different from the British rule, was not different from the Ottoman rule. They were surprised to hear from the Israelis that they have to leave. Now, of course, Palestinian leaders are not without mistakes, and Palestinians are making strategic mistakes like, interfering in the war in Lebanon or supporting Saddam Hussein. The leaders make mistakes. But as I always say, even with this I will end, even if Mother Teresa, Mahatma Gandhi, and Martin Luther King would have been the leaders of the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine would have occurred anyway and would continue to this very day.
Okay, thank you. You have anything to add to that point? Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, yes, yes, I generally agree, but I would like to say that maybe in some point I have a little bit different view. And generally, yes, I agree that that is something basic which is fundamental. I had opportunity to visit West Bank and also Gaza Strip, and I had this experience if you wait on checkpoint and how it is humiliating, and I can imagine this frustration and despair. If you are so many years, you have to meet similar experience and similar emotions, and that's why I said that it's something which is possible to accept only in terminal and not as permanent stay. And it's something why I agree with you that we need to speak about it. That is unacceptable. But I am not so sure that I can accept this notion colonialistic state. Yes, and I like to. Why? Because colonialism is connected with some ethnics which are coming from abroad and colonizing native population. But allow me to say that Israelis have lived in this territory. I know that especially in Palestine it was only small minority, but in Jerusalem it was a little bit different. There was more Jews in Jerusalem in this time, but the Jews lived also in Iraq, Iran, and Medi. That's why they was also the home of Israelis. This territory, maybe not especially Palestine, where was minority, but generally they were at home. And that is what I see like some important difference. That's why I have problem to speak about colonialism. And maybe how this story really started. As I said, it was the resolution, United Nations resolution in November 1947. And then this Israeli state was declared in May 1948. No Arab state arose under this resolution of United Nations and started attack of Arab countries on Israelis, and the Israelis created borders which did not accept this precise plan of United Nations, and this state started like a war. But on the beginning, Israelis only fulfilled this resolution of United Nations in territory when they were at home. And allow me only to make this difference, that's why I am not so sure that I am ready to use this notion of colonialism. It seems to me that it is a different process, and in this time it was also not clear that how we should differentiate between these ethnicities, because the nations started to were invented as something very modern, and we are facing something absolutely extraordinary when there were no clear borders for these countries and maybe no clear identity for these people. And it was a very complicated process. And that's why I said that I am ready to accept that in this time of war and occupation, and so I can imagine, and I'm not sure that I'm ready to use this notion and this words.
Thank you very much. Still, I would like to stay with you, Mr. Zaorálek. You mentioned there are 71 members of Association of the Czech-Israeli Friendship in the parliament. Actually, 1 hour ago, I counted them. There are 77 of them. In any case,
growing.
Maybe now we will have another figure already. In any case, it's more than 1/3 of the Czech parliament are somehow affiliated to the Czech-Israeli Association. I'm afraid it's more than Association of the Czech-Soviet Friendship, Svaz Československo-sovětského přátelství, before 1989. How it was for you to promote the balanced position of the Czech diplomacy towards the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in such atmosphere? Can you mention maybe some collisions which you remember from the time?
Yes, I don't know how his experience of Jan Kavan here during his stay in ministry, but maybe it could be similar. I remember it was very difficult, complicated discussion in Chamber of Deputy, especially because there were many. It was interest to discuss Israeli this issue, and I remember how it was difficult. Maybe it was really impossible to elaborate balanced position. But maybe I can say I try repeatedly to try to explain and speak about it. It was only what I can do. Maybe to engage in these debates, and not only as a minister but the whole time. But it's tough, and I agree with you that. On the one side, we are joking about it. On one side, I would like to say, I am glad that we have this not standard relation, that we have strategic partnership with Israelis. I am convinced, because there are many reasons why we have this strategic partnership, and also I understand that it is important that Czechoslovakia helped in 1948 to support this state and transfer arms and so, and help to create this state. And I see this like a part of our history of Czech-Israeli relations. Important. I have to accept it. I respect it. It is connected with the Masaryk and many others. So that's why I not want only to joke about it. But I agree with you that it seems to me that there are some serious roots of this relation between Israeli, but I was convinced that it's a must also to utilize this intimate partnership, and I'm convinced that if you are a friend, it does not mean that you should be you should accept everything, and that we need also to have open dialogue, and I tried to have this. I also convinced that Jan Kavan also tried to keep this open dialogue between with the Israeli politicians, and that's why I said on this that I'm convinced that right now I am sure that we have no balanced position, and we are not able to lead this direct and open talks, frank talks with our Israeli partners. It's something which would like to change. Not only have so many MPs, but to know more and to be able to be a real partner. Because we know in last weeks and months what is happening now in Israel, you have to be concerned. For example, the killing of Abu Aklab and many other events which we had in, but it's not. We can't say it's normal. It's normal. Maybe what is happening. So no, it's not normal. It's something which could be on the beginning of something more real disaster. And as we saw, as I said, as I have to repeat it, because Ukrainian countries is also connected with the human rights and with our ability to speak about human rights and respect to human rights. We can't to accept this double standard, to speak about human in Ukraine and not to speak openly, friendly, but openly with our Israeli partners about current situation in Israel.
Thank you. Maybe just explanation of your references to Mr. Jan Kavan, who is also present here. For those who don't remember it, exactly 20 years ago, Mr. Kavan, as a foreign minister, was traveling to the Middle East to meet Ariel Sharon, Prime Minister of Israel, and Yasser Arafat, the Palestinian chairman. And at the very last moment, and I remember it because I was a reporter covering your trip, Mr. Kavan was prevented to meet Mr. Arafat by his own Prime Minister, Mr. Miloš Zeman, who is today's Czech president. So I think it cannot happen anymore now because all are on the same boat of the Israeli friendship. I think there would be no such dispute behind the scene. Ilan, Mr. Pappe, tell us, what should the foreign governments do in order to solve the issue, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
Well, I think that it's connected to the disagreement I have with you about settler colonialism and colonialism. I think that what Israel has built in the West Bank is colonies. It's not settlement. These are colonies. What Israel is doing in the West Bank is colonization. 2 years after Jan Masaryk had visited Palestine in 1926, the Zionist movement already began ethnically cleansing Palestinian villages in different parts of
Too much Masaryk, probably. Only
Thomas Masaryk. Thank you. Yeah, sorry, Thomas. Oh, the Thomas Masaryk. 2 years after he visited Palestine, Zionist movement already started ethnically cleansing Palestinians, long before the Holocaust, long before the creation of State of Israel. And long before one Arab soldier entered Palestine on the 15th of May 1948, the Zionist forces have already expelled 250,000 Palestinians. We need to understand what happened in the Arab world when the first refugees from Jaffa and Haifa were arriving in the Arab world long before the Arab states went into war. We need to understand the chronology there. It's very important that the Arab world went to war in 48 after half of the Palestinians who became refugees were already arriving in the Arab world. Settler colonialism or colonialism is an important framework, and that answers, you will see how it relates to your question. Because when you will continue to say to the Israelis, my role as a Czech Republic is to help you to understand each other, to be in a dialogue with each other, this is music to the ears of the Israelis. They don't mind. They don't have to pay a price. They can invite the foreign minister. They may allow, you know, if the left was in power, they would have allowed the former prime minister to meet Arafat. The left actually is much more clever than the right wing in Israel, because they would know that his meeting with Arafat would mean nothing. That's why the left would have allowed him to meet Arafat. The right wing in Israel feels that even such a meeting, they are powerful enough to tell them not to meet. There is a certain reality that the Israeli public, the Israeli Jewish society, has no incentive to change. There's no reason for Israel to change its policy. The Jews, there are almost an equal number of Palestinians and Jews between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. The Jews have all the privileges. The Palestinians have none of the privileges. Some Palestinians live better than others. If the international community would not decide that its role is not to mediate, its role is to save the Palestinians for future destruction. That's the role of the international community. That was the role of the international community when it faced apartheid in South Africa. We have to ask ourselves, why a respected body like Amnesty International? Amnesty International is not anti-Semitic. You cannot say Amnesty International is a neo-Nazi group, as the Israelis call them now, because they don't like their report. Amnesty International is a group of professional human rights lawyers. I don't know if you read the report. This is a 37 pages report by experts of human rights international law who says that according to every definition in the book, Israel in 2022, Israel, not just in the West Bank, Israel as a whole is an apartheid state. The moment governments would be willing to frame Israel as an apartheid state, they would have to deal with it as they dealt with apartheid South Africa. Until this is not going to happen, the situation is not going to change on the ground. But I understand it's very difficult for politicians to take such a decision. You will be faced with accusation of anti-Semitism. You have your guilt complex of what Europe did in the Second World War. And the Palestinians, in the eyes of Europeans, have to pay for anti-Semitism in Europe. And that's a very bad idea altogether.
Oh, maybe you can correct me. I'm convinced, I have feeling that it was Jimmy Carter who said in 2012 that if a peace process we are not able to finish the peace process, that we can face the danger of apartheid. Is it? Am I?
It's true, and he even had a book. With
yeah. But and I agree with you, because it was also my feeling from my meetings with mainly Benjamin Netanyahu that that it was really a little bit theater. This moderation and this transfer of messages and so, and because I'm convinced that from the time of Ariel Sharon, it was impossible to finish the peace process. Maybe because you are expert, I would like to ask you: do you think that it was chance in the time of Yitzhak Rabin to finish? Maybe it was time that it was real chance, and maybe it was big chance for this territory, and then it is terrible or that it was gone. And do you agree that in this time it was chance?
Of course, it's difficult to know what Rabin would have done because, unfortunately, he was assassinated. I think that even Rabin, and I think he really meant well, was already in a mindset that would not have been able to give the Palestinians a genuine state next to Israel. Even he, with all the very personal high price he paid, believed that you can satisfy the Palestinians by giving them a small autonomous kind of autonomy, a state without an army, demilitarized. You have to remember, Rabin insisted that the Jordan Valley would be part of Israel. He insisted that the Israeli army would be on the Jordan River. He felt, and I know because I was a part of the Oslo team to begin with, he told us the Palestinian would accept it because it's a bit better from what they have. The Palestinians did not invest a liberation struggle for so many years in order to build a Bantustan next to Israel. And even, Abu Mazen, who's definitely the most acceptable leader Israelis can think about it, would not give the Israelis this idea. And Israelis ask me, why doesn't Abu Mazen willing to accept Israel as a Jewish state? Why even he is not accepting Israel as a Jewish? And he said clearly, we will never recognize Israel as a Jewish state. I'm willing to have a two-state solution, but don't ask me to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. Because the whole idea of a Jewish state, if you recognize it as a Palestinian, it means that you are willing to forget the fact that you have been kicked out of your homeland and that your homeland was turned by force into something else. You cannot ask people to do this. People who are victims of crimes should not be asked to say, you know what, I'm willing to sign here a document that says that the crime was not committed. Not one victim of crime would be willing to sign a document that said, I was wrong, a crime was not committed. They may be willing to, to get into arrangement, compensation, whatever. We have to understand this imbalance of power. I think somewhere in 1977, we missed the opportunity for a two-state solution when the Likud came to power. And they started a very intensive colonization of the West Bank. By the time we started Oslo, there were already a substantial number of Jewish settlers in the West Bank. And the settlements, which used to be small settlements, became cities already. In 1993, there were already 3 Jewish cities in the West Bank. It was already too late to talk about a two-state solution, even if both Palestinian leaders and Israelis hoped that somehow it will work. On both sides, for different reasons, their own electorate understood that this has nothing to do with the reality. And we needed another 20, 25 years to understand that it's not a status quo. It keeps changing for the worst. Every year that passes by, there's more Jewish settlers. Every year that passes by, there's a natural growth of the Jewish settlers in the West Bank. And every year that passes by, we have another generation of Palestinians who only know the Israelis as settlers and soldiers. We need to stop this process. And the only way of stopping this process is to tell the Israelis, look what a monster of a state you have built. Not for yourself. For yourself, you've built a beautiful country. I know. I'm an Israeli Jew. I have all the privileges. It's beautiful to be an Israeli Jew. But look what you have built for the Palestinians. So many years after the Holocaust, you built a racist state. If you are a Palestinian under Israeli control, you are experiencing what Africans have experienced under apartheid South Africa. Is this really the solution for anti-Semitism? I ask myself. As a Jew, I ask myself as a Jew.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Zaorálek, probably my last question before we will ask people in audience. I hope you also have some questions. Ilan mentioned that we are too nice on Israelis, that they are happy that we have some contacts with the Palestinians. Many Czech politicians and diplomats are careful not to have any critical comments against Israel. They say if we have something critical towards our friends, we say it to them behind the scene, not publicly, not through the media. Did you sometime try to have such unpleasant message for your Israeli partners? And if so, what was the answer? Do you think it helps really? It can help? It can change the situation as the probably most friendly, most pro-Israeli country of the EU having a critical message to the Israelis?
No, it was a story, this relation to Israel from my side, because it started in the time when I had been the speaker of chamber, and then in this time it was Rivlin was the speaker of Knesset, and it was different composition or of politicians in Israelis, and then in this time I have to say that. During, I was a little bit, it was not so easy, and I remember that it was some clash between me and my partners, because I told them they are making me idiot. That because and that I remember that in this time was not so easy for me to have more intensive talks, because I was very interested about this territory, and I had feeling that this discussion is not open, and that on Israel side is not willingness to have open discussion on these issues, which I was convinced are serious. But then when I started like minister, I knew that I have to use different strategy, not to have clash, and that's why I've been more careful, and it was on the beginning, and that's why I had more successful attempt to create much more intensive relations and many contacts, not only in Israeli side but also in Ramallah, in Palestine side, that's I am convinced that in this more intimate relations, we were able to speak about very unpleasant thing, and but the problem is that only what is valid in politics are results, and I'm afraid that I was able to create this much more intensive communication also about unpleasant issues, and I appreciated that Israeli side was willing to keep these talks on more open and frank level than in the time of I was a speaker. But I feel sorry, but my knowledge was that really this Netanyahu government was not willing really to make this peace process real. But I would like to add something more today, that today I have feeling that now it's not so important which government do you have, if it is Bennett, if it is Bennett or Netanyahu. I am afraid that there is no difference between these governments, and it's not that I am now expecting that will be different. I feel sorry. I feel it is different situation now, and I have no expectations that it could be government without NATO will be able to do more. That's what I am repeating today. That from the time of Ariel Sharon, I saw. Now I see no. I said no. There was no chance successfully to finish the peace process, and that's why I asked if it was different sooner, and that's why I'm convinced that also in my period and in my I had no chance to do anything concrete.
Thank you very much. So now I think it's right time for the questions from audience. So please, there was a lady in the front line asking first, then Mr. Kavan, as I see it from here. Tady vepředu. Tady. Ano. please also identify yourself before you ask, and also say who you are asking, okay? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I don't think it's working. Okay, it's great now. So my name is Ayla. I have a master's degree in political science, but unfortunately I have a book, and unfortunately I haven't been a minister. But maybe in the future, I wanted to ask Mr. Professor Pappe. Yesterday you mentioned that actually the problem with Israel isn't that civil society doesn't understand what's happening, that many people in Europe do understand, but that oftentimes the governments do not really reflect what the civil society wants and needs, and there is a big struggle in Europe in general, not only when it comes to Israel, but when it comes to climate and to minority rights. So my question would be, do you think that without fundamentally reimagining international order and how democracy works, even in the West, we can talk about solving such a big crisis and such a big conflict as a Palestinian conflict or conflicts abroad? Because studying what I've studied, I sometimes have a feeling that not only two-state solution is a corpse, but that international order as we have now is a corpse. And we kind of have to admit that it stopped working and failed miserably, and we have so many conflicts going on. Yesterday also said that you don't like to be radical. Maybe I'm a little bit more for radical and of a pessimistic one, but maybe you have something hopeful to say, because I've spent, I think, 6 years studying, and I'm now more depressed than when I was starting, because nothing seems to work, but maybe you have a better idea. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. First of all, if you only would look at international relations and politics through the academia, you will be depressed to the end of your life. One good antidote against this depression is to combine activism with academic work. Academics should never be alone in their ivory tower, talking about other people's problem as if they are not part of the problem. And I think that once you do combine activism with your academic research, doesn't matter whether it's history, social sciences, and so on, you understand very well the problem between a public opinion or civil society that believes, and that's the big crisis of politics in our time in the West, that believes that politicians are not honest when they talk about moral issues. In fact, they look at their electorate as a bit stupid people who think that morality can be part of foreign policy, that principles should be part of how you deal with ecology, for instance. What government in the world dares to go against multinational corporation, even if they know that their policies contributes to the disaster, ecological disaster in the world? Not one government in the world is willing to face these multinational corporations. So the question is why we as citizens do not demand from our politicians reflecting what they think probably is naive and insist that this is not naive. I think this is very important, and it's not going to be solved by a good article in the academia. It's only going to be solved by a strong social movement of change where politicians, and I was a politician myself, this is not even criticism, politicians have to feel that a certain position that they have would not be acceptable to their electorate and what might lead to their losing their position. And I think that more and more, that's my optimism. I'm a relentless optimist. That's my illness. I think that the younger generations of Europeans, including the younger generations of people in this country, the more that they move away from the the Second World War, the more they would be understandable of issues of civil rights and human rights, would not tolerate policies that are clearly violation of human rights and civil rights by any country, It's easy for the politicians now to have good solidarity with the people on the Ukraine. especially in the Czech Republic. Understandably, Russia is not a favorite country. I understand that. But the next stage is even more important. Can we ask the same solidarity with the Palestinian people that you are showing with the Ukrainian people? Politicians say, no, why should we do it? What benefit do we have from this, right? It's up to the civil society to make sure that political elites understand that even politically it is worthwhile. We saw it with the elections of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. There is the beginning of politicians who are reflecting certain trends in public opinion which are not dominant yet, but might be dominant. And I think that if we infuse activism with good knowledge of the situation, we will be able to challenge our political systems not to be the dead corpses that you're right. We'll put some life into them. We'll do the miracle. We'll make them, you know, like resurrection. We'll resurrect morality in politics. We have to believe in it. I'm sorry that I'm taking a bit longer on this, but I won't mention names. But I met a very young Czech journalist who I think is younger than not my children, even my grandchildren. And a young person like this says to me, you are very naive. You think that morality is connected to politics. I know, he says, from the long age of 21. He knows. He has already had such a long life experience, you know. I know that politics and moral issues don't go together, and if you want to succeed in politics, you have to forget about moral issue. Naive people think that it has something to do. When I hear it from a 21-year-old young man, I get a bit desperate, but then I remember my students, and not all of them are like this. So we have to make sure that whatever they tell us about moral issues, universal values of human rights and civil rights, if they are not at the heart of politics, then politics is just a career for the few at the expense of the many.
Thank you. You have to tell us the name of the journalist afterwards, okay? No. Now, Mr. Kavan and his question.
Thank you. My name is Jan Kavan, and as was already admitted here, I am a former foreign minister, but was foreign minister a long time before Bush. However, I remember that when I met at that time my counterpart, Nabil Shah, we both at that time agreed on what you now call a corpse, i.e. that the best solution at that time would have been a two-state solution. I admit that for many, many years I actually clung to that idea, even when it was clear that Israeli settlers were taking more and more part of the West Bank, and the result would have been Bantustan, as you correctly call it. However, my first question to you is, I understand that if you reject the possibility of two-state, which you regard as corpse, then am I right to assume that you believe that the possible solution would have been a one-state, incorporating both the Israelis and the Palestinians? Which leads me to a question. You yourself mentioned that when Israel was created, the Israelis tried hard to ensure that they would have a majority in the territory they occupied. If there is a one state, how would you ensure that the Israelis would accept a solution where, given the demographic developments, the possibility that the Palestinians will in time represent a majority is very high on the table? So that's one question, which for me is very important, because I admit that situation is a stalemate, if I use Mr. Zaorálek's term, but we need to break the stalemate. I am also an optimistic, even despite my age. However, I also believe still that morality in politics and international relations is important. Difficult, very difficult indeed, and every day we witness a contravention of it, but I still believe in it. However, can you also ask, you mentioned that you were part of or were involved in the Oslo agreements. I was looking throughout the history at which point one would be optimistic. Lubos mentioned Mr. Rabin. To me, the Oslo, at least for some time, gave a hope. So why was that defeated? Also, when I listened at the very beginning of Obama taking over the presidency to his Cairo speech, in that speech when he rejected the settlements, he made a number of very, to me, optimistic assumptions. Soon after that, he began to change his mind, or was forced to change his mind. In my opinion, his surroundings and the people in the White House sort of made sure that those ideas would be defeated. I would like your opinion on that. And last, it was mentioned the possibility of expressing unpleasant ideas to the Israelis. I did that to Ariel Sharon. And it was the most unpleasant meeting I had in the decades and decades of my political life. I never met someone who was so arrogant and so hostile and impossible to have a conversation, if a conversation is a dialogue, rather than a one-sided statement full of hostility, which I experienced from him. And for Mr. Tureček, you were right what you said, that I was prevented from meeting Arafat, but not by the Israelis, but as I think Mr. Pappe thought, but as you said, by the then Czech Prime Minister. The Israelis, just the contrary. When I realized I could not meet Arafat, I proposed to Ariel Sharon that correctly I would meet the two foreign ministers, Nabil Shah and Simon Peres. He rejected that and made it very clear in a very hostile manner that if I would propose that, they will kick me out of Israel within the next day. He made it very clear. And therefore that I have to meet him. He knew that we would not agree on a single word, but he still insisted on the symbol of meeting me, which was very, I would say, humiliating for me, very unpleasant. On the other hand, besides being a foreign minister, I was also president of the United Nations General Assembly. And in that position, I did meet Mr. Arafat and had, in fact, what to me was quite a constructive and interesting discussion with him. I had a much better discussion with Simon Peres, but with Arafat as well. And that time, he was not hostile to the idea of the two-state solution. In fact, just the contrary. At the time, he would agree with me this was a real possibility. It didn't happen. So I would like to hear from you, not about what's not possible, what is a corpse, but how do you see a solution, this one state? And my small question to Mr. Zaorálek. We are both foreign ministers, and we both know how pro-Israeli not only the Czech society is, but the Czech establishments. Almost all Czech establishments I knew about. My question to you is, what explanation you have in your own mind as to why the Czechs are, as Netanyahu or Bibi called us, the most loyal and the best friend Israel has in the EU. I was author of one of the foreign policy concepts which was approved by the parliament. At that time, I threw in a sentence that we want to have a special strategic relationship with Slovakia, which to me makes sense. However, since then, the new ones, which you know, made clear that we have two special relationships. One with our brother country, Slovakia, and another one with Israel. It doesn't make sense to me, despite the history which you mentioned, Masaryk and all that, 1948, which in fact is true, which created good relationship between us and Israel. But 1956 and onwards created good relations with the Arabs. So the two things balance each other. Why, out of all the other countries in the world, we should have a similar close relationship with Israel as we have with Slovakia? Why is it accepted as normal that there are joint governmental meetings between the two governments, Czech and Israeli? And it doesn't make sense. And I would quite like to hear your own explanation, something which I would actually be able to comprehend. Thank you very much. And incidentally, when I was in the United Nations, when I was in the United Nations, what we've agreed on is that the Palestinian conflict is the oldest unsolved problem in the United Nations. And still, every United Nations Assembly is trying to solve it, and every time we run into deadlock.
Okay, thanks a lot to Mr. Kavan, not only for his questions, but also behind-the-scene experience from visiting Jerusalem. Now, Mr. Zaorálek got very hard questions, so he needs time. So so Ilan, please, one-state solution and some ideas about it.
Yeah. You mean the question to me was an easy one, right? Yeah. I left very early on the team that was working on Oslo because I understand that even the Israeli politicians who wanted to be part of the Oslo process believed that they want to look for occupation in other means rather than proper reconciliation, and I felt I cannot be part of it. Now, in 2022, we already have a one-state solution. Israel controls the whole space of historical Palestine. It's true that it doesn't have, if you want, boots on the ground in Gaza, but it controls the Gaza Strip from the outside. In fact, it does not allow anyone to go in and anyone to go out of Gaza. Gaza is now a ghetto. A big ghetto. And Israel is now the state, is the only state in between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean. There's only one state. According to the Israeli nationality law of 2018, in that state, in that space, there's only one nation, if you read the law. And this is a fundamental law of Israel. A fundamental law is like a constitution in Israel. So part of the Israeli constitution, not the position of a right-wing government in Israel. The constitution, what is equivalent to a constitution in Israel, is that the Palestinians are not a nation, not in the West Bank, not in the Gaza Strip, not in Israel, not in the refugee camp. There is only one nation, and the Palestinians do not belong to that nation, according to the Israeli national law. However, they are tolerated as people who are living in the nation-state of Israel, that it says very clearly in the law one day would expand probably over the rest of Palestine. This means that any struggle for change, whether from within Israel, whether from the outside, is not anymore to divide the land so that some Palestinians would have better life under this nationality law and some would have a worse life. We need to change the Israeli mindset and to say to them, there are two nations living there, not one nation. And since the way the nations are living with each other, the Israelis have two options. Either they take out all the settlers from the West Bank and allow the Palestinians to have their own nation state, which, as you rightly say, Arafat was for, Abu Mazen is for, the Palestinian leadership is for. Now, you and I know this will never happen. This will never happen. Israel will not take the settlers out of the West Bank. This is a given. This has nothing to do with pressure and so on. The basis, therefore, for the future is changing the human rights and the civil rights of the Palestinian within the one state of Israel, because that's the only state that exists there. There will be never two states there. There will be a state, And the question is, can we change the regime? Maybe not 100%, maybe only 80%, maybe only 70%. There is a binational state in Palestine which Israel doesn't recognize. But Israel is a binational state. There are two nations. We need a binational state to be recognized by the Israelis and by the international community. With binationalism, a lot of responsibility comes. You have to make sure that every nation is feeling safe and secure. Now, it is true that demographically, one day, and that day is not far, the Palestinians would be the majority. There's no doubt about it. There's really no doubt about it. The Palestinians would be the majority in this state. And this is my job, not your job. My job is to convince the Israelis that the idea that if Palestinians are a majority, or if a Palestinian is a prime minister, this is the end of the Jews in Palestine. My job is to say to them, this is a racist position that is baseless, that has nothing, there's no evidence for this. In fact, the Palestinians are far more believing in democracy, because they are a minority, than you, the Israelis, believe in democracy. The Palestinians have no reason in the world not to want to live under democracy. The Israelis have all the reasons in the world not to live in a democracy. And I think this change of our mindset about the Palestinians as people who have everything to gain from living in a democracy, and Israelis who have everything to lose in living in a democracy, should inform our position towards Israel. And to say to them, we're sorry, in the 21st century, to have a state that is based on the racist idea that if any Palestinian that is born in Israel is a danger, and every Jew that is born in the Czech Republic becomes automatically an Israeli citizen, is an unacceptable moral position. And if we, as a government in the Czech Republic, go along with it, you are on the wrong side of history. Like all the governments who supported apartheid South Africa. I think this is very important. So I believe in a binational state. I believe in a one-state solution. I know it would be very difficult. I'm not eluding myself. But I think that this is the only option. And when this is the only option, you have to build it. We wasted 55 years on the wrong solution. That isn't working. We are entitled to try another 10 years of a different solution. Nothing bad comes out from putting our minds as human beings and finding. A binational state is not a happy marriage. It's not a happy marriage. It doesn't mean people would love each other. But the whole Arab world is built by groups of people who were forced by Western colonialism to become nation state. Lebanon is not a normal nation state. Syria was never a normal nation state. Iraq is not. Palestine and Israel are not normal nation states. The whole Middle East would have to work out this balance between the group identities and the nature of the state, because the current regimes, not only in Israel and Palestine, the current regimes are not working. They're not working. That's why we had the Arab Spring. The Israelis have one problem, really serious problem. They think that they are not part of the Arab world. They either think that maybe because Eurovision they are part of Europe, or they have this dream of an earthquake that would take them out of the Arab world and, I don't know, append them to the Czech Republic because you are the best friends of Israel. I want you to be neighbors of Israel. Believe me, you'll become anti-Israeli in 5 minutes. You don't want them as your neighbors. Ask the Palestinians what it means to have Israelis as your neighbors. I really think the idea, and this comes to the demographic issue, if you understand that you are part of the Arab world, you are part of its problems, and you are part of its solutions, the whole attitude of the Arab world towards you will change as well. Israel sends the message, we're not part of the Arab world. We are the Europeans in the Middle East. The Arab world is like a big ship in the middle of a very rough sea. And it can either drown or find a safe harbor. Israel is on that ship. I always say to the Israelis, the fact that you have the best cabin on the Titanic doesn't mean that you are not on the Titanic. So you have to be careful.
Thank you. So now a view from the wrong side of history from Mr.
I would
Zaorálek.
like to comment it also. There was a question on Oslo. Yes, also maybe to remember. But when you started to speak about Oslo agreement, I would like only to ask. Many times, President Rivlin repeated to me that he is also the supporter of this idea to create one state of Arabs and Jews, because he told me I was born and I've been with the Arabs all the time, and I am convinced that the only solution to live next, it is the same idea of Rivlin. No.
Rivlin, I used to work in the Israeli Knesset, and Rivlin had an office next to me. And we used to have this conversation. And he said to me, like you, I believe in one state. I said, with the Palestinian equal citizens, right? He said, no, don't. I mean, it's one state, but the Palestinians cannot have the same rights as we, the Jews. But they have rights. They have rights. And he said, you know, they will be happy because compared to the rights of Arabs in the Arab world, it would be much better. That is exactly how they... This is the racism that refuses to accept that Palestinians have intellectuals, academics, democratic people, non-democratic people, religious people, secular people. It's a normal nation. It's a normal nation. And it is not different from the normal nation of Jews in Israel. Jews live in this assumption that the Palestinians are totally different. You cannot trust them with democracy. They don't need full citizens because they're Arabs. Arabs don't need full citizens. All they need is a camel and a tent, according to the Israelis. Believe me, I'm a product of the Israeli educational system. Obviously a flawed product. They didn't expect me to become like this. I know exactly what you are being taught in school about Palestinians. This is one of the most racist educational systems in the world. This is something you don't know if you don't read Hebrew. If you are not part of the Israeli education system, you don't understand the kind of images that are planted in us about the Palestinians. And this is why Ariel Sharon was not a marginal figure. Sharon represented very well the vast majority of Israeli Jews. They have the same attitude as he has. There are others, I know, there are others. But the vast majority think that way. The only way to change, to deprogram people with such racist notion is to make sure that they understand that there is a price tag to this position. One last sentence. Most of the white people in South Africa believed in apartheid even when apartheid fell. But now I go to South Africa often. Every white person I meet in South Africa tells me I was against apartheid. I said, if you all were against apartheid, why it took so many years to topple it down? Believe me, I may sound like an idiotic optimistic, but believe me, once we change the regime in Israel, a lot of Israeli Jews would tell you, oh, we were always against this racism system and so on. We need to find the brave international community that would allow us to put pressure and change a reality which affects everyone, not just Jews and Palestinians, but everybody in the Arab world and beyond.
Thank you. So now Mr. Zaorálek and his explanation of the pro-Israeli prevailing attitudes in the Czech society and maybe political.
Yeah, no, maybe if Ilan Pappé has 10 myths about Israel, maybe this special relation, this 11th myth, and maybe it's my, because you know very well when I spoke about these deep roots, a common history and so, but I'm convinced that it means nothing to have 77 MPs in Israeli-Czech friendship groups. It means nothing because if you have a real, true relation, you have really to engage, to know more. Real relation means that you are trying to know more and to reflect and to have really deep dialogue and so. And I am afraid, but it seems to me that all this strategic partnership and group and friendship groups, it's absolutely superficial thing. It does not mean that these members and all these are really interesting, what is really happening in Israel. They really don't, maybe they have some superficial imagination about history and so, but it's not true relation. And that's why I'm convinced that it's also a myth. And it has no sense. It would be better really to read books and try to know more, to understand better what is happening in Israel. And all these are only signals, symbols, but nothing really, nothing real, nothing true, only myth.
Thank you. So I think we still have a chance for the last, the gentleman over here. Very brief question, please. No comment, just a question and very brief answer. Thank you.
I am a Palestinian, 85 years old. I am a Palestinian, 85 years old. I am here, and the Nakba, I was in the Nakba. I remember everything in the Nakba. From the beginning till now, unfortunately, the international community on the side of Israel, not with the Palestinians.
And please, your question, please.
Oh my God, I want to say something. I have the opportunity today. Allow me for just few minutes, please. Yeah.
We have to finish 7:30, okay? So
this
that's
is
why.
the same. You want to stop us to speak. Even you, even anybody. Okay. You don't want to allow us to say something about our country. This is our people. We have the opportunity to explain to the people here how we lived, how we was. I myself, in that time, I was escaping during the night. We are looking for Ukraine now. We had the same, even worse. I want just to say from the beginning. From the beginning, the international, they were, in even 47, it was given, the Palestinian given just, but the Israeli was 55% of population nearly, and they had 55% of Palestine. And nobody asked the Palestinian about to be divided or not. Nobody. It was decided from the beginning till now. It was only decided to give this resolution at the end, and it is this you have to accept it, and till today. I want to say two man, but I am already fed up.
Okay, thank you very much. So, still, please, is there a question? There is in the very back, please, the last really question. Thank you. We have special guests here, so why not to ask them?
Thank you. My name is Nico Besnier, and no country has expressed any interest in being their prime minister so far, so I have to content myself with being a professor of anthropology at the University of Amsterdam and a visiting professor at Universiteit Karlova here. There's been a lot of talk about geopolitics, macro geopolitics. How about grassroots geopolitics? And I'm thinking in particular about the BDS movement, which has not been mentioned. So this is for you, Ilan Pappé. I'm an admirer of yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Jamal. I think one of the things I did in my book in the Czech language is exactly to tell the story of the Nakba as you remember it, and hopefully many more Czech people would be informed of what you remember and you know happened to the Palestinian people. I do hope so. We will continue and make sure that the Nakba is not denied, and that the ongoing Nakba would stop. We will do everything we can. For the question, yes, I think it's very interesting that, academics would rightly say to you, there are certain differences, important differences, between apartheid South Africa and Israel, even if you think that Israel is an apartheid. But activists felt, and rightly so, in 2005, that in order to change the reality in a state where there is no chance for a change from within, inside Israel, it is very important to think on the non-violent means used by international society, not community, to try and force apartheid South Africa to change its policy. And this was a model that inspired activism, not because they thought that apartheid South Africa and the situation in Israel is the same. They thought that the public opinion that influenced the governments in Europe, and you have to remember, it took 21 years to convince the first European government to impose sanctions on South Africa. It was two ladies in Ireland who refused to make an account in the supermarket to another Irish lady who had goods from, she bought in the supermarket commodities that came from South Africa. And the two ladies who were doing the account refused to do the account. They told her, you have to go and return the things that came from South Africa. We don't want to help the South African apartheid regime. They were fired in Dublin. The next day there was a national strike because it was a chain of supermarkets. And they striked. From that action to the first government that ever suggested sanctions on apartheid South Africa, 21 years passed. So the BDS movement is actually an attempt to say, we in the civil society believe that what these ladies did in Ireland is fitting attempt to say to Israel, you are not respecting human rights and civil rights, and therefore we call for boycotting your institutions, your academic institution, your cultural representative, and so on. The idea is to try and pressure the governments to take a far tougher position on Israel. Any boycott, and we know it from history, any boycott, any civil action like this is a dialogue. It's not punishment. It's a dialogue. It's a tough dialogue with people, telling them you are not fully aware of what you are doing, and we want to wake you up to see that this is what you do. So grassroots politics, in the case of Palestine, is very important, has changed dramatically in favor of the Palestinians. I cannot compare Europe of 1980 to Europe in 2022. However, our biggest mission is how to make this grassroots politics the politics of from above. This is our mission, I think, as people who believe in the Palestinian struggle and who support the Palestinian struggle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we really have to finish. I would like to thank both of our guests, Professor Ilan Pappé of University of Exeter and Mr. Lubomír Zaorálek of the Czech Republic. Thank you that you spent your precious time with us. Thank you for your attendance, for your questions, and let me to remind you, especially those who came later, there is a book written by Ilan Pappé. I think he will gladly sign you a copy if you buy it over there on the desk on the right side. Have a good evening.